When we think of Italy in antiquity, we invariably think of the Romans, a people needing no explanation, who grew to dominate not only this peninsula, jutting out into the water of the Mediterranean, but the whole of the Mediterranean region itself, as well as far beyond its shores. There is, however, a civilization which is far older than the Romans, which inhabited the region of north-central Italy known as Etruria, to whom the Romans owed a great deal, both politically, socially, and culturally: the Etruscans. Before even the Romans coalesced into a united people, the Etruscans flourished in Italy, founding great city-states which dominated their homeland and the regions which lay beyond. Rome itself was subject to the Etruscan hegemony, and ruled by a dynasty which hailed from Etruria long before the Republic was established. Indeed, the Villanovan culture, held to be the earliest iteration of Etruscan civilization, rose to prominence around the year 900 BC in northern Italy, and it is from these roots that the Etruscans blossomed. Influenced by the Greeks, whose colonies brought not only Hellenic but Near Eastern influences, the Etruscans developed complex political institutions, beautiful artistic works, and wrote in their own language. Their traders enjoyed friendly relations with Phoenicians and Carthaginians, enriching the already verdant valleys of Etruria. Their armies asserted control over the Po Valley and the coastline of Campania. It was a fascinating mixture of indigenous belief and Greek mythological influences. Therefore, today we will attempt to better understand this little-known people, and to answer the question: who were the Etruscans? Before we go any further, it is well worth taking a moment to situate ourselves and to understand where the Etruscans dwelt. Their territory, Etruria, was a region roughly delineated by the Arno and Tiber rivers, west of the great Apennine mountain range, the spine of the Italian peninsula. Although Etruscan influence extended northwards to the Adriatic and southwards as far as Naples at the height of their political power, it is this land, bounded by the two rivers, which formed the Etruscan heartland, encompassing the northern part of the modern region of Lazio, large parts of Tuscany and Umbria, and the southern fringes of Emilia-Romagna. The land of the Etruscans was, as it still is, a verdant territory. Although today the area is known for rolling hills and lines of picturesque cypress trees with small pockets of woodland, analysis of sediments at Lake Vico returned a dizzying array of pollen particles from the Etruscan period, over 750 species, all heavily associated with oak woodland. This has therefore led to the conclusion that the landscape of ancient Etruria would have been heavily forested, with pockets of cleared space occupied by farmers, settlers, and the city-states of the Etruscans. Whilst the region enjoys hot summers and a good deal of sunshine, it also endures cold winters, which would have blanketed the woodlands clustered around the foothills of the Apennine Mountains with snow. To the west, Etruria is bordered by the Tyrrhenian Sea, a part of the Mediterranean whose name derives from the Greek term for the Etruscans, Tyrrhenoi. The broad estuaries which drained into the Tyrrhenian Sea were surrounded by a broad marshy region known as the Maremma. Although these marshes were subsequently drained in the 19th and 20th centuries, during the Etruscan period they would have been vast wetlands, incredibly humid in summer and teeming with malaria-carrying mosquitoes. As well as the mighty Arno and Tiber and a number of smaller rivers, Etruria features several lakes, formed as a result of prehistoric volcanic activity, including crater lakes such as Lake Vico and Lake Bolsena. It was in this verdant landscape that the Etruscans lived and flourished. The highly fertile soil provided them with a plethora of crops. The hills yielded precious metals such as copper and silver, and Etruria's position in Italy on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea allowed the Etruscans to travel and trade, establishing and maintaining links with people further afield. The origins of the Etruscans are greatly obscured by the fact that no literary historical texts concerning their origins written in Etruscan survive. Like many ancient peoples, we are therefore reliant on the texts of Greek and Latin authors in order to paint a picture of the origins of the Etruscans. Broadly, the classical writers advance two theories: that the Etruscans were indigenous to the region, and that the Etruscans had migrated to Etruria from the Aegean Sea. Writing in the second half of the 5th century BC, Greek historian Herodotus asserted that the Etruscans were the descendants of exiles from the Anatolian kingdom of Lydia, who sought relief from a famine which was afflicting their homeland. Then the one group, having drawn the lot, left the country and came down to Smyrna and built ships in which they loaded all their goods that could be transported aboard ship, and sailed away to seek a livelihood in a country, until at last, after sojourning with one people after another, they came to the Ombrici, where they founded cities and have lived ever since. They no longer called themselves Lydians, but Tyrrhenians, after the name of the king's son who had led them there. Similarly, late 5th century BC historian Hellanicus of Lesbos reported that the Etruscans were originally from Thessaly and had migrated to Etruria via the Adriatic Sea, capturing the region. Those, however, who had turned inland crossed the mountainous part of Italy and came to the territory of the Umbrians. However, scholarly consensus suggests that these tales of migration from the Aegean Sea are not accurate. Indeed, hitherto there has been no archaeological evidence discovered to support a migration theory, and it was only in the 5th century BC, hundreds of years after the apparent first appearance of the Etruscan culture, that Greek sources begin to promote the idea of an Aegean origin for the Etruscans, and associate the name Tyrrhenian with Lydia. Etruscan metalwork and pottery bear close resemblances to other locally made products in the region. Towns and cities appear to have remained static, with no sudden foundation of new settlements which would likely accompany the influx of a large number of new people to Etruria. And whilst cremation burial appears to have given way to inhumation, that is, burial of the entire body, around the 8th and 7th centuries BC, this process was not universal nor instantaneous, as might be expected if the Eastern migration theory were true. It would therefore seem most likely that the Etruscans were native to Etruria. The first Greek author to mention the Etruscans, Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BC, asserts that the Etruscans were the indigenous inhabitants of the region. Furthermore, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BC, evaluated various origin stories of the Etruscans and came to the same conclusion. Note that Pelasgians is the name used by ancient Greek writers to refer to the prehistoric inhabitants of Greece, those that came before the Greeks. For this reason, therefore, I am persuaded that the Pelasgians are a different people from the Tyrrhenians, and I do not believe either that the Tyrrhenians were a colony of the Lydians, for they do not use the same language as the latter, nor can it be alleged that, though they no longer speak a similar tongue, they still retain some other indications of their mother country. For they neither worship the same gods as the Lydians, nor make use of similar laws or institutions. The earliest evidence that denotes a culture that is specifically Etruscan is the Villanovan culture of around 900 BC. It is this culture which is held by scholars to be the earliest iteration of Etruscan culture, from which their city-states and political identity developed. The Villanovan culture, so named for a burial site discovered near Villanova in northern Italy, itself developed from the 12th century BC Proto-Villanovan culture, a part of the wider Urnfield culture. Named for the custom of cremation burials in urns, the Urnfield culture encompassed Central Europe from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Furthermore, genetic studies have corroborated these theories. For example, a 2019 study did not find significant genetic differentiation between the Etruscans and Latins sampled. Similarly, a 2013 study found that Etruscan DNA was very similar to that of Neolithic Central European and Tuscan populations, further rejecting the idea of an Anatolian origin. Etruscan history, as we understand it, is generally subdivided into 5 distinct periods. The first of these was the Villanovan Period, which is deemed to have begun around 900 BC. Our knowledge of the Villanovan period of Etruscan civilization is rather murky, due in large part to a paucity of sources. We are instead reliant upon archaeological evidence to create an image of life in early Etruria. This situation is not helped by the fact that many Villanovan settlements were built over in later periods of Etruscan history. Settlements, however, do appear to have been relatively small, and made up of simple houses constructed of wattle and daub. Political authority would no doubt have been very localised, and based around these small settlements, and the presence of high-quality grave goods suggests the existence of a political elite. The increasing size of Etruscan cemeteries during the Villanovan period attest to the fact that Etruscan settlement began to expand, and the discovery of Villanovan grave goods in new regions suggests that the Etruscan civilization was expanding northwards into the Po Valley, where Bologna was one of the most important centres, westwards towards the shores of the Adriatic, and southwards along the shores of Campania. These regions were settled not only to take advantage of verdant agricultural land, but also in order to access passing trade, both of which provided Etruscan settlements with plentiful food and goods from abroad, but also furnished them with increasing wealth. However, despite the apparent simplicity of these early Etruscans, grave finds portray them as excellent metalworkers and craftsmen, particularly in bronze, skills which were no doubt influenced and developed by increasing contacts with neighbouring cultures, in particular the Greeks. In fact, it was deepening ties with the Greek colonies in southern Italy, especially that of Pithecusa and Cumae, which had an incredible influence upon Etruscan culture, ushering in the so-called Orientalizing Period. The increasing contact with Greek cultural ideas had a profound effect not just on the Etruscans, but on much of southern Europe as far east as Spain. Greek colonies spread across the Mediterranean facilitated this cultural exchange. For the Etruscans, the Euboean Greek settlement of Ischia in the Gulf of Naples was of particular import. The introduction of writing, the spread of Greek aristocratic culture, heroic ideology, and methods of combat appear to have led to a widespread cultural shift, which saw Etruscan society incrementally adopt these elements of Greek civilization. Etruscan political elites imported ever-increasing amounts of prestigious Hellenic pottery, amongst other goods, and threw up enormous burial tumuli in the Eastern Mediterranean fashion in order to distinguish themselves from their more common compatriots. It was not simply Greek influence which the Etruscans felt, but Near Eastern influences too, transmitted via the Greeks but also by the Phoenicians, whose vast network of trading colonies and outposts permitted and accelerated cultural exchange. Although the Phoenicians established no settlements in Etruria, they certainly traded with the coastal cities of the Etruscans, such as Volsi, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri, and established commercial colonies on the islands of Sardinia and Sicily. The fact that no Greek nor Phoenician colonies existed north of the Bay of Naples is notable and suggests that the Etruscans likely guarded their territory with force. In fact, such was the apparent maritime supremacy of the Etruscans that the Greek historian Ephoros, writing in the 4th century and cited in Strabo's geography, noted that Greek sailors and traders were wary of venturing into the regions close by to Etruria for fear of naval attacks by the Etruscans. For before that time, men were so afraid of the Tyrrhenian pirates and the savagery of barbarians in this region that they would not so much as sail thither for trafficking. Naval conflict notwithstanding, the Etruscans were increasingly incorporated into the wider Mediterranean world, becoming steadily more urbanized. The city-states of Etruria were, in all likelihood, very similar in form and culture to the Greek city-states of southern Italy, autonomous political units in control of their direct hinterland, and often considerably further, and which were able to assert and expand their political influence through a mixture of military force, economic might, and diplomatic coercion. Etruria was no centralized state, but rather a region of disparate city-states, united by Etruscan identity. By the 580s BC, the cities of Etruria had grown powerful. United by religion and a wider culture, these polities nonetheless possessed their own diverse cultural identities, as well as differing, at times markedly, in the political and economic spheres. Many ancient authors make mention of what they call the Etruscan League, a loose confederation of 12 or perhaps 15 cities, whose leaders met at the Farnum Voltumnae, the chief religious sanctuary of the Etruscan civilization, suggesting that the League, and therefore Etruscan political organisation, was largely united by faith. It may well also be the case that the ancient authors such as Livy, who mention the Etruscan League, were using the Ionian League, a collection of 12 confederate Greek states in Western Asia Minor, as a model. Very little is known about the League, other than what our unclear and at times contradictory sources tell us. Servius the grammarian, writing in the late 4th or early 5th century BC, suggested that there were 12 Etruscan kings who would meet at the sanctuary, whilst Livy states that a king was actually elected from amongst the representatives of the 12 cities. Livy names this elected leader of the Etruscan League as sacerdos, meaning priest, hinting at the religious nature of the League, and perhaps suggesting the intrinsic link between kingship and priesthood. The great consolidation of political power in the hands of the major Etruscan cities that took place in the Archaic period not only saw these polities establish hegemony over smaller settlements, but also had the knock-on effect of encouraging expansion northwards and southwards into regions which were less subject to the control of the great cities. Archaeological evidence points to the establishment of new cities in the Po Valley, such as Marzabotto, San Polo d'Enzo, and Forcello, cities which were apparently founded by colonists from larger Etruscan cities. In these cases, Orvieto and Chiusi. It is worth noting that this northward expansion appears to have been somewhat precipitated by increasing instability in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Access to the Adriatic allowed the Etruscan settlers easy access to fresh markets and trade routes. To the south, Etruscans increased their influence in the coastal areas in which Etruscans had previously settled during the Villanovan Period, regions in which the Etruscans lived alongside other peoples, such as the Latins and the Samnites. Indeed, Rome itself was ruled by the Tarquin dynasty during this period, a royal family of Etruscan origins. This southern dominance was not to last, however. Naval pressure from Syracuse, incursions from Latin hill tribes in Campania, and the famous overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty of Rome in 509 BC, and the subsequent foundation of the Republic, would eventually break Etruscan influence over the regions south of Etruria. Loss of control in Campania was not the only challenge faced by the Etruscans. The Greek colony of Aleria on Corsica, founded by settlers from Phocaea, became a thorn in the side of Etruria when its navy began raiding shared Carthaginian-Etruscan trade routes. This threat was only ended in 540 when a joint Etruscan-Carthaginian fleet destroyed the Greek ships of Aleria, and the colony was occupied by the Etruscans. According to Herodotus, such was the brutality of this conflict that the Etruscans unceremoniously executed their captives. The Carthaginians and Tyrrhenians, who had got into their hands many more than the Phocaeans from among the crew of the 40 vessels that were destroyed, landed their captives upon the coast after the fight and stoned them all to death. By the early 5th century, the Etruscans, although bloodied by military defeats in the south, remained a powerful force, and their city-states exerted enormous political and economic influence. The following centuries, however, would prove to be disastrous, culminating in the eventual conquest of Etruria by a people who would go on to dominate the Mediterranean for decades, the Romans. We shall complete the historical narrative later. For now, we will focus on the society and the culture of the Etruscans. Etruscan cities, like the city of Rome, were traditionally ruled by kings, who stood at the head of Etruscan society. However, the institution of kingship gradually waned as Greek influences began to have a greater effect upon Etruscan society, gradually giving way to a democratic system from the 6th century onwards, albeit one dominated by oligarchic elites. A number of magistrates existed to dispense and direct the state, and it appears that religious power was closely linked to state authority. Notably, the city of Veii clung to monarchy. It has been suggested that it was this system of government which effectively isolated Veii from its fellow Etruscan cities, as Veii's wars with Rome escalated. Haynes thinks it likely that Greek-style tyrants, that is, rulers who seized power by extra-constitutional methods, usually by courting the support of sections of the urban population, of the kind that ruled Syracuse and Cumae, may well have emerged to rule a number of Etruscan cities during the Archaic Period. The intense period of urbanization which accompanied Etruscan expansion made this far more likely. The common people of Etruria are far harder to glimpse in the historical sources. However, we do know that during the Archaic Period, the great expansion and political consolidation of the Etruscan cities led to an increase in the classes who might be considered plebs, people in various kinds of servile conditions, as well as free men and women. The conquest of smaller settlements by the more powerful cities of Etruria led to an influx of the defeated inhabitants into urban centres, fundamentally changing the previous social landscape. The old aristocracy, previously dominant, now had to contend with a politically aware urban class, bolstered by the many foreign merchants who lived in emporia throughout Etruria. In fact, the increasing wealth that trade and manufacture brought to Etruria likely created an increasingly large middle class, similar to those that existed in contemporary Greek city-states. The Etruscans were known to use slaves for a variety of their daily tasks, and acquired them from all over the Mediterranean. Taken primarily as prisoners of war or purchased from their trading partners, these slaves were domestic servants in wealthy homes, had integral roles in agriculture, mining, and metalworking, as well as being used as both soldiers and entertainers. Slaves were depicted consistently as being smaller in stature than Etruscan citizens, demonstrating clear attitudes about their diminished social status. However, despite their subjugation, they were not always entirely anonymous, and are sometimes named in surviving artworks. Due to unclear evidence from our surviving Greek and Roman sources, the distinctions between slaves, freedmen, and low-level labourers in Etruscan society has been hard to distinguish. It does appear that it was possible for slaves to increase their social standing if manumitted, particularly through gaining economic success or by excelling in skilled labour. The stratification between masters and slaves, apparently without many intermediate social or economic classes, appears to be the picture our Roman sources paint of Etruscan society. However, it seems likely that alongside slaves, there must have been serfs or subject classes who also performed agricultural or industrial labour. In ancient Greece, and the earlier days of the Roman Republic, women were largely confined to the house, and would rarely, if ever, participate in social activities with men. Etruscan women, however, appear to have lived quite different lives. Etruscan women were present at, and involved in, all kinds of events. They attended competitions between naked athletes, and participated in physical exercise and sports. One tomb painting depicts 3 women at a chariot race, a sight that would have been entirely unheard of in ancient Greece. Records show that a number of Etruscan women were literate, could inherit and own property, and conduct trade on their own terms. Graffiti on pottery vessels marking the name of a female owner demonstrates both property ownership and their right to drink wine like their husbands. Numerous inscriptions provided the names of both the father and mother of the person commemorated, a convention not practiced amongst the ancient Greeks. In funerary inscriptions, women will often identify their full personal name, alongside their patronymic, showing the importance of their own identity and position in Etruscan society. Theopompus, the 4th century BC Greek historian, was shocked by the supposed debauchery of Etruscan women, and while much of the insults he levied against them appear to be exaggerated or misinterpreted, he was right that Etruscan women would indeed often attend banquets with their husbands, reclining together with them on a common couch. Similarly, the audacity of Etruscan women was much discussed and oft disapproved of in later Roman sources. Titus Livy, in his History of Rome, tells the story of Tullia, the daughter of Servius Tullius, an Etruscan king of Rome in the 6th century BC. Tullia and her sister married 2 brothers of the royal Tarquinius family, but her sister married the bolder of the 2. Livy writes that Tullia despised her sister because, having got a man for a mate, she lacked a woman's daring. Tullia then plotted with her brother-in-law to murder their 2 spouses, and afterwards to overthrow and kill her father. After this murder, Tullia reportedly drove her carriage over the corpse of her father, spraying herself with his blood. To this day, the Romans call the road on which this happened the Vicus Sceleratus, the Street of Infamy. The moralizing and disapproval of many of our ancient sources has likely distorted our understanding of the real lives of Etruscan women. Beyond that, the majority of our evidence relates largely to elite and privileged individuals, and thus we have even less information from which to surmise the daily lives of ordinary Etruscan citizens. Regardless, it appears clear that women occupied a more privileged position in Etruscan society than many of their Greek and Roman counterparts, and participated actively in the social lives of their cities. The importance of the Etruscan military and of Etruscan military culture is sometimes a little neglected amongst discussions of this people, perhaps since it was military defeat to the Romans which eventually led to the rapid decline of Etruscan political power, especially since much of what we know concerning the Etruscans comes to us from the victorious Romans. Like contemporary cultures such as the Romans and Greeks, warfare was an intrinsic part of social and political life for the Etruscans. Social status was heavily influenced by military rank and participation in campaigns, and in a society with strictly delineated classes, martial prowess and success was one of the only ways in which an individual may be able to ascend the social ladder, at least for men. What is more, regular warfare was a normal part of life, with the summer season usually being reserved for campaigning abroad, either with the intention of raiding in order to gain loot, or else for the purpose of conquest. A good deal of debate exists regarding the organisation of the Etruscan army, in particular whether the fighting men of the army were divided into units based upon ethnic, familial, class, or purely financial grounds. The well-documented census of the 6th century Roman king Servius Tullius, who was himself an Etruscan or of Etruscan origin, has been cited as evidence for how Etruscan armies may have been organised, with frontline troops consisting of men aged 17 to 45, subdivided into 5 classes organised by wealth and equipped accordingly. However, this is hard to assert with much certainty. It may well have been the case that Etruscan armies were far more aristocratic or kinship-based, and that the majority of common citizens were not required to serve. Certainly it appears that by the Archaic period, the Etruscans had begun to adopt the more citizen-focused military organisation of Greek warfare, based around the figure of the hoplite citizen soldier. Despite this, the Etruscans never seem to have wholly adopted this style, as it was somewhat at odds with the more aristocratic structure of Etruscan society. More certain is the archaeological record, which provides us with a sufficient number of artifacts to be able to better understand the practicalities of Etruscan warfare. Shields, wide and round, constructed of bronze and decorated, are ubiquitous throughout Etruria. An increasing level of Greek influence can be seen as the earlier flat shields give way to more convex examples as the centuries progress. Helmets are another element of Etruscan warfare which survive. Many of these are a very simple style of semi-spherical helmet, some with attached cheek flaps in a more Greek style, and highly decorative examples such as the one discovered at Lanuvium also exist. Most curious of all, however, is the so-called crested helm, fashioned from 2 separately forged plates, which were then pressed together and joined at the crest. Many examples, such as this very early 9th century helmet made of bronze, feature decoration on the crest, in this case bosses which would follow the shape of the crest. It seems likely that such large and elaborate helmets would have perhaps been used for ceremonial purposes. Its size and shape would have made it rather impractical in battle. Etruscan armour, much like Etruscan shields, appears to have been very similar in form to contemporary Greek armour, with bronze cuirasses secured in place with leather straps and bronze greaves to protect the lower legs from blows. Armour was likely also constructed of leather. When it comes to weaponry, swords and spears appear to have been most commonly used, as they are regularly found at Etruscan sites, particularly tombs. Notably, the weaponry that has survived generally bears a resemblance to early Roman weaponry, with broad spear points and sword blades. The presence of horse bits and chariots in Etruscan tombs would suggest the use of horses and chariots in combat. However, they may also have simply been symbols of status for deceased Etruscan nobles. Whether or not the Etruscans fought in phalanx in the Greek style with interlocking shields and bristling spears is unclear, and the presence of hoplite-style weaponry in graves does not necessarily prove the phalanx. As discussed earlier, it may well be the case that these items were included in the graves to establish prestige. It could be that the Etruscans utilised the phalanx during the early period of their ascendancy in northern Italy, and whilst fighting amongst their own city-states, before later abandoning the practice. Roman sources are undoubtedly somewhat biased in their depictions of Etruscan warfare. The late 1st century BC historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in Rome, described the general disorder with which the Etruscans engaged in combat, referring to them here as barbarians. When the barbarians learned that they were ready to fight, they uttered their war cry and came to close quarters, in the barbarian fashion, without any order, or horse and foot intermingled, in the expectation of utterly annihilating them. Furthermore, it may well be the case that the Etruscans invented, or in some way originated, the salpinx, a war trumpet also utilised by the Greeks, a claim made by the 1st century BC historian Diodorus Siculus in his Bibliotheca Historica. The salpinx was a simple bronze trumpet consisting of a long and narrow bronze tube with a bell on the end, used in warfare to disseminate orders to troops above the noisy tumult of a battlefield. Oft neglected is the naval prowess of the Etruscans. Although we know little of their boats or naval warfare techniques, they were apparently able to resist any attempts by the Greeks or Phoenician colonists to form settlements in Etruria, and participated in a number of noted naval battles. The Etruscans, like most of their contemporaries, possessed an economy which centered around agriculture. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus noted the verdant nature of Etruria's soil. Not the least of these things which have contributed to their luxury is the fertility of the land. For since it bears every product of the soil and is altogether fertile, the Tyrrhenians lay up great stores of every kind of fruit. Cereals and pulses were grown in abundance, providing not only food for human consumption, but also forage for cattle. It appears that the Etruscans practiced the clever form of irrigation, using underground tunnels cut into rock in order to drain waterlogged land and provide water to crops during dry spells. These tunnels were accessible by vertical openings, through which water could be drawn. Olives and grapes, well suited to the climate of Etruria, were also grown in huge numbers, allowing for the production of wine and olive oil for both domestic use and export. However, the bounty of Etruria was not simply formed of agriculture, but extended to precious metals, which could be found beneath its soil and in the hills and peaks of the Apennines. Copper, essential for the production of bronze, was found here in great quantities. Similarly, silver was mined, which was worked into jewellery or other decorative objects. More practical was iron and lead, which was put to a variety of uses, such as toolmaking and construction. Trade, too, was an incredibly important aspect of the Etruscan economy. Owing to their proximity to Greek and Phoenician trade routes, combined with their apparent seamanship, the Etruscans appear to have participated fully in wider Mediterranean trade, not only importing goods from abroad, but also exporting a good deal of their own product in later centuries. Bronze, pottery, and wine flowed from Etruria, likely carried on multi-stage trips both westwards and eastwards. Participation in trade would have enriched the Etruscans, as would the levying of tolls on passing trade. Roads and paths were constructed crisscrossing Etruria, allowing for the easier passage of carts across the landscape, facilitating greater economic exchange. During the Archaic Period, Greek trading posts began to emerge on the coast of Etruria, operating under the protection of local cities, and we know from Aristotle, writing in his Politics, that the Etruscans reached some form of commercial agreement with the Carthaginians. Inspired by imported Greek products, Etrurian craftsmen from Cerveteri, Tarquinia, and Vulci created and exported decorative pottery and glass bottles for the storage of perfume. The distinctive Etruscan bucero pottery, which we will discuss later, has been found as far afield as Asia Minor, Syria, Carthage, Spain, and the Rhine region, where Celtic aristocrats considered Etruscan pottery, particularly pieces associated with the consumption of wine, to be an exotic and prestigious luxury. Although rather slow to adopt coinage, some Etruscan cities did utilize bronze ingots of roughly standardized weight, stamped with the emblem of a leafless branch from the early 6th century onwards. This likely served as a form of currency to better facilitate long-distance trade. The general consensus amongst scholars and linguists is that the Etruscan language was Paleo-European, or pre-Indo-European. That is, it existed before the arrival of Indo-European speakers. Paleo-European languages gradually went extinct as their speakers merged into communities increasingly dominated by Indo-European language speakers, a fate which befell the Etruscan language as it was slowly replaced by Latin over a number of centuries. Interestingly, the only Paleo-European language which remains to this day is Basque. Etruscan is relatively well preserved, as over 13,000 inscriptions have been found to date, although the vast majority of these are very short in length. Originally thought to be an isolate language, more recent scholarship, particularly that of German linguist Helmut Rix, has promoted the idea that Etruscan belonged to what he called the Tyrcenian language family, due to its similarities with the Raetic language of the Alps and the Lemnian language of the Aegean Sea, specifically the island of Lemnos. The date at which these Tyrcenian languages may have split is, of course, subject to a good deal of debate, ranging from pre-Bronze Age to as late as 900 BC. Roman historian Livy appears to assert in his History of Rome that the Raetic language of the Alps was an offshoot of Etruscan. The Alpine tribes are undoubtedly of the same stock, especially the Raeti, who had throughout the nature of their country become so uncivilized that they retained no trace of their original condition except their language, and even this was not free from corruption. Pliny the Elder agrees. The Raeti are believed to be people of Etruscan race driven out by the Gauls. Their leader was named Raetus. The Etruscan alphabet is derived from the Greek alphabet, specifically the Euboean alphabet, likely due to cultural exchange and contact with the colonists from the island of Euboea, who established settlements in Campania in the 8th century BC. This, in turn, formed the basis for the Etruscan alphabet, whose letters are very similar in form. This early alphabet was first attested around the year 700 BC. The tablet of Marsiliana, found at the Etruscan city of Vulci, is one of the earliest examples, and this 7th century BC Bucero cockerel is one of the finest and clearest. Like all elements of language, the Etruscan script was subject to change and regional variations. This early script was used until around the 5th century BC, before apparent modifications were made, including the dropping of some letters. This period of New Etruscan lasted until the extinction of the language, around the turn of the millennium. Etruscan had a marked influence upon the Romans and their Latin language. In the early centuries of Roman history, Etruscan was used alongside Latin, and according to Roman historian Livy, was taught to Roman boys before being replaced by Greek. Research on Etruscan inscriptions has found that the language was still alive and well in the 2nd century BC, and that both Latin and Etruscan coexisted on wall paintings, inscriptions, and gravestones. However, the ascendance of the Romans gradually saw the importance and usage of Etruscan in Etruria wane, a process that began in the south of the region. By the mid-1st century AD, Etruscan had apparently vanished from even the most northern reaches of Etruria. Although a hypothesis exists that knowledge of Etruscan endured amongst the priestly class of the region for decades or even centuries. Byzantine historian Zosimus, writing at the close of the 5th century AD, noted how the prefect of Rome, Pompeianus, performed rites recommended to him by men from Etruria in order to stave off the rapacious army of Alaric the Goth, who explained that a town called Nevaea had delivered itself from extreme danger, the barbarians having been repulsed from it by storms of thunder and lightning, which was caused by the devotion of its inhabitants to the gods in the ancient mode of worship. Having discoursed with his men, he performed all that was in his power according to the books of the chief priests. Regular religious practice was an important part of Etruscan life. The Roman historian Titus Livy, writing in the late 1st century BC, described the Etruscans as being devoted beyond all others to religious performances because they excelled in the method of conducting them. The Etruscan religion was polytheistic in nature. They believed that all physical manifestations were representations of the will of the gods, and that the gods acted continually in human affairs. They had a lengthy and complex pantheon, headed by Tin, the ruler of the sky and wielder of thunderbolts. Tin himself largely kept away from human affairs, serving primarily as peacekeeper amongst the gods. His consort, Uni, was the supreme goddess of the Etruscan pantheon and was associated with marriage, fertility, and childbirth. Their daughter, Minerva, was goddess of wisdom and had associations with war and medicine, as well as various meteorological phenomena. Nethuns was the god of waters, Sel the goddess of the earth, and Aeta the god of the underworld. The Etruscan god Veltha was closely associated with vegetation, the changing of the seasons, and the cycles of life, and was possibly considered the Etruscan national god. The Etruscans believed that their religion had been revealed to their ancestors through legendary seers, and they relied on these revelations to interpret and appease the will of the gods and predict the future. The primary founding prophet was considered to be Tages, grandson of Tin, who was said to have the face of a child but knowledge of a sage. Cicero records the story of a man ploughing the earth in the countryside of Tarquinia who came across a crater in his path from which Tages sprung. The ploughman's shout of exclamation gathered a large crowd, and Tages spoke to them, and they recorded his words. This, Cicero claims, was believed by the Etruscans to be the origin of their soothsaying practices. There are tales of other prophets revealing such religious knowledge to the Etruscans, with different regions preferring their own local links. Further north there are tales of a sibyl, a nymph named Virgoia, who was an expert in the reading of signs from lightning strikes, and the flight of birds. Whatever the origins of these methods may be, we learn from references in later Roman sources that these revelations were preserved by priests in a collection of religious texts that was known as the Etrusca Disciplina. The Etruscan Disciplina provided detailed instructions on the interpretation of omens, included the reading of signs from the entrails of sacrificial animals, known as haruspicy, and the observation of the behaviour of birds, known as augury. It divided the sky into various regions, each associated with specific deities, and explained the meaning of various types of lightning bolts to aid in the interpretation of celestial phenomena. It also included general information on the observation of rituals, including city-founding ceremonies, the consecration of temples, and burial rites. Priests would consult these texts, interpret the signs, and instruct people on how best to serve the gods. This bronze votive liver, found in Piacenza, demonstrates the complexity of these prophetic instructions, and the skill and training needed to interpret them. It features 40 different sections and references many different gods. The priest would match imperfections in the liver of the sacrificial animal with the corresponding sections of the votive liver as a means of divining which god was in need of offerings. In Etruscan religious practice, there are two main types of animal sacrifice. In one, the offering was burned on the altar to honour the celestial gods, with the rising smoke reaching the heavens. In the other, the blood of the animal was drained into a conduit beside the altar and offered to the gods of the underworld. Through such observances, Etruscans sought to maintain cosmic balance, appeasing the varied divine forces that governed the world. Similarly to the ancient Greeks, Etruscans would present votive offerings at temples and sacred spaces, such as rivers, springs, caves, and mountains, as well as leaving them in tombs to curry favour for the deceased in the afterlife. The inscriptions found on these offerings suggest that they were made by both sexes and were offered by all classes and kinds of people. Interestingly, the Etruscans believed in predetermination, so despite the immense effort put into the interpretation and prediction of the future and appeasing the gods, they had minimal belief in their power to change the course of events, at best hoping to slightly alter, postpone, or redirect the inevitable. The Etruscans had developed their own indigenous religion by at least the 9th century BC. However, increasing trade with Greece and regular contact with Greek settlers led to the absorption of significant Greek mythological elements. Greek pottery featuring mythological scenes became a popular Etruscan import, influencing Etruscan art and religion. Early Etruscan gods, while powerful, had been largely abstract, not depicted in human form, but rather with vague and elemental qualities. This Greek influence appears to be a significant factor in the increasing anthropomorphizing of Etruscan gods, as they gradually took on more human qualities. By the 5th century, many Etruscan gods had been tied to Greek counterparts, which can be seen in evidence from black figure pottery, in which inscriptions were added, giving Olympian gods Etruscan names. Tin and Uni were matched with Zeus and Hera. Aita, the god of the underworld, became a clear parallel of Hades, the counterpart of the Greek goddess Athena, Menvra. Fulfuns was linked with Dionysus, Cels with Gaia, and Nethuns with Poseidon. There were figures that will be recognizable to those familiar with Greek and Roman mythology. The Lassa were female spirits, often associated with nature, as well as fate and prophecy, and bear similarities to Greek nymphs and Roman lares. The Vanth were winged female demons who often appear in Etruscan tomb art, associated with death and the afterlife, and although more benevolent in nature, they are compared often with the Greek Furies. The Vanth are often shown guiding the deceased, sometimes with Karu, who serves a similar function to the Greek ferryman Charon, who transports souls to the underworld. Tinas Cliniar, the twin sons of Tin, appear to be equivalent to the Greek Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, and are associated with protection and horsemanship. Despite these parallels, Etruscan gods had many distinctive features, and cannot be reduced to mere counterparts of the Greek pantheon. The Etruscans had distinct conceptions of the afterlife. Their gods were invested with different powers and interests, and their knowledge and practice of divination far exceeded that of the Greeks. As with virtually all cultures and peoples, art did not, and does not, exist in a vacuum. Artistic styles, materials, and methods are all heavily influenced by prevailing trends and schools of thought, be they domestic or from further afield, and the interplay of these artistic ideas invariably gives rise to fresh styles still. The Etruscans are no exception to this rule. As their influence expanded and their elites grew rich from the 8th century onwards, deepening contacts and trade with foreign powers, in particular the Greek city-states, saw the import of Greek artistic works, as well as pieces from further afield. These, in turn, fundamentally influenced Etruscan art, transmitting styles and techniques from not just Greece, but the wider Eastern Mediterranean, including Phoenicia, Egypt, and Assyria. Pottery was one discipline practiced by the Etruscans, who despite importing large amounts of Greek pottery, did produce many of their own pieces, starting from around the 7th century BC. It may well be the case that some of the earliest potters were Greek migrants. Certainly the practice of painting vases was another Greek style imported by the Etruscans, utilizing first the black figure and then the red figure styles. Later pieces often depicted Greek mythological scenes, and despite regularly lagging several decades behind the latest Hellenic styles, Etruscan vase paintings are of a high standard. It may well be that Etruscan potters pioneered the kantharos and kyathos in clay, drinking cups with double or single looping handles respectively. Despite the obvious Greek influences, Etruscans did have a rather unique style of pottery, created with a blackened clay and often elaborately decorated with fine white lines, a style known as bucero. These ceramics gained their distinctive black colour via the firing method used. Instead of the clay being fired in a kiln in the ordinary fashion, the kiln flames were starved of oxygen by the closing of vents, which allowed the ingress of air. As the kiln filled with smoke, an interesting chemical reaction occurred, and oxygen molecules were sundered from the iron oxide in the clay, thereby turning the pottery from the usual red to black. The resulting pottery was then polished to give a lustrous finish. Traceable back to the far less refined impasto pottery of the Villanovan culture, bucero pottery became increasingly elaborate and well crafted. The quality of the clay was improved, allowing Etruscan potters to create extremely thin-walled, delicate pieces known as bucero sottile, some less than 2 mm thick. Pottery was often decorated with lines and patterns scored into the clay before firing, or with designs in relief, some of which were highly decorative. As the centuries wore on and Etruria became increasingly Hellenized, Bucchero pottery declined in importance and popularity, with its design relegated to more generic imitations of Greek styles. Etruscan painting was not simply limited to pottery, as there are a number of wall paintings found in tombs across Etruria. Undoubtedly, these works owe their existence to the Greek tradition. However, the relative scarcity of extant Greek wall paintings lend the Etruscan examples a greater importance. Although supposedly not so advanced as the finest Greek examples, Etruscan frescoes, which were created by painting onto wet plaster using animal hair brushes, display beautiful artistry. Dating from the mid-7th to the close of the 3rd century BC, these artworks most often depict mythological scenes, symposia, and hunting, as befitted the tombs of Etruria's elite. One artistic area in which the Etruscans truly excelled was sculpture. In contrast to the primarily stone sculptures of the Greeks and Romans, the Etruscans worked mostly in terracotta, bronze, and alabaster, a kind of soft rock highly suited to sculpting. Although heavily influenced by Greek sculptural trends, Etruscan art differed markedly in that most human figures were depicted clothed, as opposed to the Greek preference for sculptural nudity. Relatively small bronze sculptures became an important Etruscan product, which were exported abroad in large quantities. It is thought that the famous Capitoline wolf was the work of a craftsman from Etruria, but this has come under scrutiny more recently, with a 12th century AD dating suggested, although inconclusively, from carbon dating. In such works, we see the Etruscan penchant for metalworking, particularly in bronze. Such was the wealth of Etrurian talent that Pliny the Elder described how 2,000 statues were looted from the city of Volsini alone. There are also Etruscan statues dispersed in various parts of the world, which beyond a doubt were originally made in Etruria. I would have supposed that these had been the statues only of divinities, had not Metrodorus of Skepsis, who had his surname from his hatred to the Roman name, reproached us with having pillaged the city of Volsini for the sake of 2,000 statues which it contained. The outstanding Monte Leone chariot is an incredibly well-preserved example of Etruscan metalworking skill, with its panels depicting Homeric scenes in relief, Achilles riding a chariot pulled by winged horses, and a shield displaying a Gorgon's head. Amongst the most striking Etruscan sculptures are the decorated sarcophagi, which depict an array of reclining figures, often couples, joined in death as they were in life. A particularly stunning example is the sarcophagus of the spouses. Made of terracotta, this large sculpture would have been brightly painted in its day, the smiling faces and almond-shaped eyes of the couple brought to life by the addition of colour. Funerary urns similarly featured images of the deceased reclining on a couch in miniature, or else a rendering of the head. Cremation burials do appear to have continued despite the increasing prevalence of inhumation as the centuries wore on. In the early Villanovan period, the houses of Etruria came in the form of simple wattle and daub huts, of a kind depicted in early funerary urns. By the 7th century, with the influence of the Greeks in full effect, Etruscan building technique had developed, with buildings centered upon earth walls, based on solid rubble foundations. Walls were customarily coated with lime plaster for the purposes of preservation, and in order to resist heat. Floors appear to have commonly consisted of earth, beaten flat. Colonnaded porches and central courtyards featured, particularly in elite residences. Roofs were tiled with terracotta, and notably terracotta decorations appear to have been popular amongst the Etruscans in the form of antefixes, decorative blocks which covered the overlap on the outermost tiles of a roof, and acroteria, decorations placed atop the apex or corners of a pediment. Terracotta frieze plaques, often depicting processions of human figures in Greek and Eastern Mediterranean style, also survive. The Classical period was a time of immense upheaval for the Etruscans. Increasingly hemmed in by burgeoning powers, the Etruscan cities were forced, primarily by military means, to cede increasingly large amounts of territory to rival powers. The Greek city of Syracuse, under the tyranny of first Gelon and then Hieron, rapidly expanded its control of the region surrounding Sicily, first defeating the Carthaginians at the Battle of Himera in 480 BC, and then the Etruscans in 474 BC in a naval battle off the coast of Cumae in the Bay of Naples. These battles, seen by the Greeks alongside the 480 Battle of Salamis as the defeat of the barbarians by Hellenic peoples, allowed Syracuse to expand its hegemony over the southern part of the Italian mainland, and naval control over the southern parts of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Etruscan naval power was further damaged by creeping Syracusan mastery over the Tyrrhenian Sea, apparently achieved over a number of decades. The foundation of a Syracusan garrison on Ischia in 465 BC, and successful naval raiding against the coastline of southern Etruria, as well as Corsica and Elba. So great was the apparent naval decline of the Etruscans that in 413 BC they were only able to contribute a paltry 3 ships to the Athenian siege of Syracuse. In the south, Etruscan control of coastal regions of Campania, already weakened by the overthrow of the Tarquin dynasty and the repeated invasions of hill tribes such as the Samnites, was effectively ended by the close of the 420s, particularly with the loss of Capua in the mid-420s to Samnite invaders, Nola in 423 BC and Cumae in 421. This territorial loss brought with it marked political decline, as Etruscan coastal cities were cut off from their historic trade routes. The export of pottery, in particular those pieces associated with the consumption of wine, declined dramatically. Grave goods become poorer, and there is a distinct lack of public building works in cities such as Cerveteri and Vulci. The quality of artistic works from southern Etruria declined too, likely due to a lack of inspiration precipitated by a sudden cut-off from close Greek contacts. However, in the north the story was quite different. Apparently shielded from economic decline created by the loss of the Tyrrhenian Sea, the cities of inland Etruria and the Po Valley continued to prosper for a time longer, likely due to their high agricultural productivity and access to the trade routes along the Apennine Mountains, the River Po, and the Adriatic Sea. Cities such as Populonia, for example, remained wealthy, importing and producing fine artistic works and even minting gold and silver coinage. It was in the classical period too that the Etruscans' losses to the Romans began in earnest. It must be stressed that Etruria cities were by no means a monolithic state that acted in unison against the Romans. Rather, it was individual cities which chose to pursue war or peace. Veii, the closest Etruscan city to Rome, had long had an antagonistic relationship with the new republic, supposedly wiping out the entire Roman Fabii clan, save one boy, at the 477 BC Battle of Cremera. It was therefore Veii which bore the brunt of Roman aggression, losing Fidenae in the Veitine War of 437 to 435 BC, before Rome declared a full-scale war in 406 BC, set upon the destruction of the powerful Etruscan city. After a lengthy siege, the city fell to the Roman dictator Camillus in 396 BC. The city's male population was reportedly slaughtered, and its women and children enslaved. It is telling of the disunity of Etruria that during this brutal and protracted conflict, the Romans maintained friendly relations with the city of Cerveteri, as far as mutually granting hospitality to each other's citizens. The Romans continued their aggressive expansion into Etruria throughout the 4th century BC, occupying Sutri and Nepi in 383 BC. In the 350s BC, a brutal conflict was waged against Tarquinia, a conflict which Cerveteri joined, this time against their erstwhile Roman allies. Both Etruscan cities were forced to accept peace treaties in 351, effectively reducing them to the state of subject allies. The Etruscans thus partially subdued, the Romans turned their attention to the Volsci and Samnites to the south. An uneasy peace reigned in Etruria until 311. The decades-long peace between Etruria and Rome was suddenly broken in 311 BC when an unusually large alliance, which appears to have included all the remaining independent Etruscan cities, save for Arezzo, attacked Sutri. The siege was only resisted by the Romans with great difficulty, and took 2 years to achieve. Pushing their advantage, the Romans forced their way into the regions of the Upper Tiber, subduing Perugia, Cortona, and Arezzo, and concluding treaties with them which effectively made these Etruscan cities Roman vassals. Roman consul Decius Mures succeeded in wresting territory off the Volsini in 308. According to Livy, so terrifying was the onset of Decius that the Etruscan League desperately requested peace. He made his name so dreaded that the whole Etruscan League begged him to grant a treaty. There was not the slightest chance of their obtaining one, but a truce was granted them for 1 year. They had to provide a year's pay for the troops and 2 tunics for every soldier. That was the price of the truce. Etruscan resistance was not totally absent. Subsequent attempts by the citizens of Arezzo to oust the pro-Roman ruling class failed, and in the decisive battle of what came to be known as the Third Samnite War, many of the Etruscan cities joined the Samnites along with the Umbrians and Gauls in confronting the Romans. The utter defeat of the coalition forces paved the way for Roman domination of the Samnites. The disunity of the Etruscan cities, as well as the still strong aristocratic stratification of their societies, left them ill-prepared to resist the formidable might of Rome. In 294, Volsini lost vast swathes of its hinterland to the Romans, and Roselle was outright conquered. A joint Etruscan-Gallic force was roundly beaten at the Battle of Lake Vadimo in 283 BC, and by 273 BC, Tarquinia, Orvieto, Vulci, and Cerveteri had all been forced to cede large portions of their territory to Rome. In 264, an apparent attempt by the slaves of Volsini to revolt against their masters led the Etruscan aristocracy of the city to appeal to Rome for aid. The Romans quashed the rebellion, but also transferred the remaining population of Volsini, which had been the site of the Etruscan sanctuary of Farnum Voltumnae, to a new, less defensible location. By the mid-3rd century BC, Rome had effectively established hegemony over the once proud Etruscan city-states. The process of assimilation, by which Etruria became increasingly Romanized, was well underway. Etruscan aristocrats, many of whom had long enjoyed good relations with the Roman elite, began to rise in Roman society, some even reaching the rank of senator from the 2nd century BC. Interestingly, the highly stratified aristocratic structure of Etruscan society, with a very large servile class working the land on enormous estates belonging to powerful landowners, appears to have endured. The great land reformer Tiberius Gracchus noted how the countryside of Etruria was almost entirely given over to this servile agrarian system, and was nearly absent of free peasant farmers. His attempted land redistributions were clearly opposed by the Etruscan elite, amongst others, and ended in the death of him and his brother. It should be noted that this situation was most acute in southern and coastal Etruria. In the north and the interior of the region, numerous freedmen still worked their land beside aristocratic estates. In 91 BC, the Etruscans once again protested the similar attempted land reforms of Livius Drusus, and notably opposed the proposed extension of full Roman citizenship to Italian allies. No doubt such an egalitarian move would have severely damaged the power and wealth of the Etruscan elite. However, a few short years later, the Etruscans gained that prestigious Roman citizenship by remaining loyal to Rome throughout the 90 to 88 BC Social War, in which Rome's Italic allies revolted. The subsequent prolonged and brutal civil war waged between Roman generals Marius and Sulla from 83 to 82 BC saw much of northern Etruria side with the vanquished Marius. As a result, Talamone, Populonia, Volterra, Arezzo, and Chiusi saw fierce fighting, and punitive action from the victorious Sulla in the form of proscriptions, massacres, confiscations, and land seizures, with much of the territory subsequently being gifted to Sullan veterans. Resistance rumbled on for several decades in the form of abortive rebellions, whilst many dispossessed Etruscans made for North Africa. Boundary stones south of Tunis have been found carved with Etruscan inscriptions. When, in 27 BC, the Emperor Augustus declared Etruria to be the 7th region of Roman Italy, the once proud Etruscan nation effectively ceased to exist. Despite this official proclamation, Etruria had long stopped operating as an independent polity in any meaningful sense. Whilst Etruscan was still used, Latin had become increasingly common in funerary inscriptions from the 2nd century onwards. Augustus did re-establish the Etruscan League, but wholly under Roman auspices. Despite the slow decline of the Etruscans, the region enjoyed new prosperity under the stability brought to the Roman Empire by Augustus Caesar. Elites from Etruria continued to participate in Roman society, and Etruscan haruspices were apparently well respected, and their proclamations sought after. However, Etruria's cultural heritage gradually faded, first into obscurity and then into extinction as the region fully assimilated into the Roman Empire. The Etruscan language in the 1st or 2nd century AD, and religious rites perhaps as late as the 5th century AD, if the account of Zosimus concerning Etruscan priests attempting to repel the invasion of Alaric the Goth are to be believed. Although the cultural heritage of Etruria ceased to exist, awareness of its history endured, particularly amongst prominent Etruscan families and Roman antiquarians. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.